Coming up, let's talk what happens when perfectly good EGR valves go bad. I'm talking about coolant loss and potentially, at least, catastrophic engine failure. So, why does this happen? How does it happen? And can you avoid it? That's next. I'm John Cadogan from AutoExpert.com.au, and I get new cars cheap for buyers here in Australia. Even with this horrendous computer chip shortage that is going on now, we still manage to deliver cars. Go figure. Website for that, obviously. Or you can just click the card that occasionally magically appears by YouTube Voodoo. Up there now, dude. Today's Q&A is inspired by a dude named Brad. Hi John, I'm seeking your advice after a friend's new Ford SUV was diagnosed for coolant loss by the Ford dealer. Can a leaking EGR valve cause coolant loss? If how, and where? Excellent question, Brado. If, how, and where. If only I'd had $10 for every time somebody had asked me the if, how, and where of something. So let us drill down into this, starting with the lowest common denominator proposition, which is, what's EGR and why is it there? Okay, EGR stands for exhaust gas recirculation, which off the top does sound like rather a bad idea, like filthy exhaust gas going back in the clean end of the engine. Why would you do that? And the answer is, well, principally it's to increase human health by minimising the production of NOx, or oxides of nitrogen, which are toxic chemicals produced in typically lean burn conditions in engines. So when your engine's just loping along, they can lean out the mixture and the temperature increases and a whole bunch of good things happen, but one bad thing that does happen is that the oxygen and the nitrogen in the air combine. And this is because when you take a big fat deep breath, do it now, and you think about the volume of air in your lungs. If you've got 5-litre lungs, which I guess is pretty typical if you're a dude and you've exercised a bit, then of that 5 litres, about 4 litres is nitrogen, and the remaining 1 litre is mainly oxygen. See, air is 78% nitrogen, 21% oxygen, and 1% everything else. So it's nitrogen to oxygen, 4 to 1. And normally they don't mix. But when your engine goes, sucks a lot of air into it, and there's not enough fuel because it's in a lean burn condition, which is kind of what lean means, like not enough fuel for all of the air that's been sucked in. And what happens is, during ignition and expansion, like when you're extracting the energy, there's a lot of heat and a lot of pressure, and oxygen and nitrogen, which are generally disinclined to hook up and have a little fling, under the influence of these conditions, they do that just a bit. Some of the more miscreant sort of recidivist molecules out there, they hook up and then they form these oxides of nitrogen. It's bad for human health, causes acid rain and that tobacco-coloured smog. So at the end of the day, these emissions controls are there for human health, basically. So we shouldn't poo-poo them too much because there is a fairly altruistic motivation behind that. Anyway, what can happen is, if you tap into the exhaust flow, which is not really filthy, it's just got a lot of kind of hot, inert components in it with low reactivity, right? If you tap into that and pump a little bit of that back into your engine when you don't need a lot of power, when you're just loping along on the highway in those lean burn conditions, then you dilute the association between oxygen and nitrogen molecules in the mixture, and they don't hook up as often, which is a net benefit to human health. And the other thing about EGR is, in some engines, typically the ones with throttles, so gasoline engines and some diesels with throttles, right? When you've got EGR at low loads, volumetric efficiency is increased. So that's a net benefit to efficiency and operations and things of that nature, okay? So EGR is not all bad, and this default proposition that EGR is just ridiculous is absolutely false, okay? An EGR system is incorporated in the vehicle for the best reasons, and like everything else, it just has to be implemented well so that it can do its job robustly for a long service life, especially given the potential for catastrophic failure, okay? So what I'd suggest is that this is probably a Ford Everest that's been diagnosed with the coolant loss, because it would not be my first rodeo with people emailing me about that, and they seem to have scrimped on the R&D there vis-a-vis integration of R&D. It doesn't mean that EGR is bad. It means that R&D of everything needs to be done well, otherwise the ownership experience is a little bit sucky. Okay, so what happens is they tap into the exhaust system in between the exhaust port and the turbocharger. And they do that because down there, the flow is highly energetic, and that means it'll get itself back into the inlet. Thanks very much. And they need a valve because you need to control how much is being allowed in to suit the operating condition of the engine at that time, all right? And the other thing you need to do is you need to build in a cooling system for the EGR valve, because it is operating in one of the hottest parts of the engine system, which would be where the flow is really, really energetic in between the port and the turbocharger. Okay? And the easiest way to cool it down is to just tap a little bit of the general cooling system from the engine, tap some water out of that, and run it through the EGR block. They tend to be sort of a monoblock kind of thing, typically stainless steel, and then there's a valve in it, basically, which is driven by a solenoid, and then there's a water jacket running through the guts of it so that it doesn't overheat. And also to cool down the exhaust on the way back into the engine, because it's nice to recycle the exhaust gas, but not so much to heat it right up, which is why they put intercoolers on turbos, for example. Okay, so with that in mind, the failure mechanism in play here is that the water jacket fails. It might be by virtue of just underdoing the R&D of that device, right? So if the water jacket fails, what can happen is exhaust gas that should be tapped out and going into the engine gets into the cooling system of the vehicle and vice versa. So you can lose water from your cooling system through a defect in the water jacket, and then that water will escape into the EGR system and get pumped back through your engine and ultimately disappear out of the tailpipe. The problem with this is that cooling systems generally have a fair bit of reserve capacity in them, so you can lose quite a bit of the working fluid in most situations. Not so much if you're towing a 4 billion tonne caravan up the friggin' north face of the Eiger or something. But, you know, just loping along on the highway, it's really not that hard for your engine. It's not producing a great deal of power. There's not a great deal of waste heat, and there's a lot of sort of reserve capacity in the cooling system. So you can lose a bit of coolant and lose a bit of coolant and lose a bit of coolant, and all of a sudden you get to a sort of critical amount of coolant in the system where it can no longer keep up with the demands of maintaining the hot bits of the engine at or below their sort of critical failure temperatures. And then all kinds of friggin' cats and dogs living together events happen. Your engine might seize, you could crack the head, you could blow a head gasket. It's generally the mother lode of all complete cockhead failures when that happens. And I know I'm kind of laughing at that, but it's hardly a laughing matter halfway to Dingo Piss Creek when this happens, right? It's always bad. And this is why there's such an imperative upon engineers to integrate these systems reliably. And quite often the failure here is a bean counter driven failure, because X budget is allocated to get this right, and maybe you need X plus 25% to get it really right, okay? And you see it all the time in all kinds of different systems. This brand over here is renowned for this kind of failure, and this brand and this powertrain, whatever, renowned for the other kind of failure. And it can usually be tracked back to that. But realistically, if you discover that you have purchased a car, it's like, I don't know, 6 or 7 years old, and you want to hang on to it for a while, and you know that it's renowned for this kind of thing, like that particular integration in the Everest, it's a ticking time bomb, more or less, after about 80 or 100,000 Ks. So better to bite the bullet, I think, early and replace the EGR valve as a preemptive strike against catastrophic failure than to wait for it to happen, because however much it's going to cost you to go out and replace the EGR valve off the bat, it's going to be a hell of a lot more if you crack the head or seize the engine or even just blow the head gasket because the whole friggin' thing overheats. Not to mention the magnitude of the inconvenience that can be suffered in a place like Australia, when you can be not just hours, but days from any kind of rational support. I mean, Dingo Piss Creek is a long way from the city, and in between there's all kinds of places that you could visit, and there's not too many dealerships dotted along the highway between a lot of those places, right? So realistically, I'd suggest that if you own a vehicle that is in that sort of 6, 7, 8 years plus age bracket, then you need to do the research on what its strengths and weaknesses are. And then if there is like a ticking time bomb kind of red flag, then you really need to preemptively attack that, because it's always cheaper to go in hard early before there's a problem than just to be a victim out there somewhere at random. And let's face it, it's never going to happen just out the front door of the dealership, is it? It's going to happen when you are, you know, as far away from home as you can be, or else there's going to be a whole bunch of other imperatives in play at the time. Like, guaranteed this kind of thing happens to people on the way to job interviews, taking the pregnant wife to hospital because she's in labour. There's all of these kinds of events in life, and that's when Murphy strikes, right? So do the research and preemptively attack the weakest link in your car. And in the case of those Fords, that does happen quite a bit. And if you want to go adventuring, reliability is pretty important. So just do the research, do the preemptive strikes, but that's how EGR fails and leads to catastrophic engine failure via massive coolant loss. Anyway, I hope this shot isn't too confronting. I won't know until I get it in edit. And if it's terrible, 50% of the way to terrible, I'm just going to run the video and you'll just have to cope with it, because do I want to come back down here and say all of this again off the bat? Not so much.